To London Airport come Princess Elizabeth and the Duke, taking the place of their Majesties.
Only a week earlier, the King had been seen in public saying goodbye to his daughter as she and her husband set off on a long Commonwealth tour. Elizabeth and Prince Philip had been called in to deputise because of the King's ill health.
It is good to see His Majesty looking so well.
I think it was considered that he was very much better because he had been suffering from a cancer. And although, of course, in retrospect, when one looks at the photographs, the news or official photographs taken of him saying goodbye, he does look terrifyingly ill. But there was no fear that the King might die or anything like that. And so although she was sad to be saying goodbye, I don't think for a moment we would have gone if it had been thought that there was any likelihood that he was going to die so soon.
Jambo, happy meeting you. Jambo.
The first stop on their tour was Nairobi, Kenya. Princess Elizabeth's cousin, Lady Pamela Hicks, was her lady-in-waiting on the tour.
We'd had the official part of the visit to Kenya in Nairobi and all the ceremonies that had to take place over several days. And then the real highlight was we were to go up to the treetops, which was this tiny, they called it a hotel, but it was, I think, 3 bedrooms at the most, built in a giant fig tree over a salt lake and a water hole in the forest, where we were to watch game. And it was wonderful because Princess Elizabeth had her cine camera, and we saw everything. You know, a lot of buffalo and the elephant, and we couldn't have asked for more. And the princess was so excited and so thrilled. But unfortunately, she went up that ladder as a princess, and she came down the next morning as a queen.
The structure of our constitution suggests that the moment a monarch dies from one heartbeat to the next, the primogeniture, the firstborn, son or daughter if there aren't any sons, immediately becomes monarch in an instant. So that took place in the middle of Kenya because the king died on the 6th of February, early morning at Sandringham, and at exactly that time, Princess Elizabeth was up looking at the wildlife of Kenya, and she became queen. And she had no idea that she had become queen.
Back in Britain, the news was broken to the public.
This is London. It is with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the King, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep earlier this morning.
The nation was stunned by grief, as South London schoolgirl Jill Marseille remembers.
I think I was 11, 12 at the time, and I must have come home from school for lunch. I came out and the lollipop man was waiting to see me across the road, and he was crying. Well, in those days you didn't see men cry, so I was quite upset, and I can remember his lovely white hair and bright red cheeks, all these tears. I said, "What's wrong? What's happened?" And he said, "The King's dead."
Meanwhile in Kenya, Elizabeth had moved on to Sagana Lodge, but officials had been unable to get the news of the King's death to her. Elizabeth still had no idea that she was queen.
Signals had been going out in code to Government House Nairobi that the governor was en route to Mombasa. And so all the decoding things were in the papers that he had.
When the news of the King's death eventually reached Sagana Lodge, it was decided to tell Prince Philip first. The job fell to his equerry, Mike Parker, as his former wife recalls.
He said afterwards, when he got home, he said, "Poor chap," he said, "I felt so sorry for him." He said he looked as if the world had fallen on top of him when he actually had to tell her.
We could see them walking up and down, up and down. Obviously he was telling her. And then she came back into the lodge And very typically, I mean, was very controlled indeed, but just said, "I'm so sorry, it means that we've all got to go back home again." And I remember thinking, oh, it's so awful, because she was very close to her father. And I thought, oh dear, her father's died, and gave her a big sort of hug and a kiss. And then suddenly thought, my God, she's queen, and then gave her the appropriate curtsy.
The new queen flew home to an intimidating reception.
We were looking out of the windows, and we could see the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and Clement Attlee, the leader of the opposition. And then she said, oh, they've sent the hearses, because her own car wasn't there. It was the big official black limousines that she always sort of referred to as the hearses. Suddenly, when she said that, one thought, goodness, there's this young woman of 25 and her young husband, a very, very successful naval officer, 2 small children, and this is the end of their private life. From now on, this is a public life forever after. And it was quite a shock. And then I think you probably have seen the photographs of her standing at the top of the steps, all alone, and then coming down. I think that's such a poignant, lonely photograph.
There's still a feeling deep inside that you will always be part of me. So now I look for you.
Elizabeth's new life had begun.
And as I wander, I pray.
The train draws out, and the king begins his last journey to his capital, 100 miles away.
Here was a man who took on an institution really on the brink after the abdication, and then steered the nation through a war, and I think that inspired enormous affection. And I don't think people fully understand how much they cared about him until he died.
It is a grey and bitterly cold day. Now at King's Cross, the royal train draws in. Before the Queen, his daughter, the widowed Queen, his wife, and Princess Margaret, the great ordeal begins.
The king's body would lie in state in Westminster for 3 days before being buried at Windsor.
We all had to be dressed in deep mourning, and going to Harvey Nichols and buying a veil, which had to be a certain size, a black veil, which we all had to wear.
The enormous crowds, completely silent. And then when the procession comes, just the sound of those muffled drums, and then you hear the beat of the soldiers' boots. And it's unforgettable, it really is.
And there, walking slowly behind the glass coach, are the 4 royal dukes.
While Richard Dimbleby described the funeral for the BBC, his 7-year-old son Jonathan was watching at home.
I remember that it was a really moving, sad, public occasion, and that my father was affected by it. You see, my father was of a generation for whom King George VI represented a heroic leadership for the nation in crisis, in war.
And in the uniform of Admiral of the Fleet, there in the centre of your picture, His Royal Highness, the Duke of Windsor.
Among the mourners was the dead king's exiled older brother, the Duke of Windsor, who in 1936 had given up the throne. His abdication had changed the line of succession to George VI, and now to Elizabeth.
My father was also aware that this was going to place a huge immediate burden on a very young woman who was to be Queen Elizabeth II.
The king is dead, long live the king, and means there's no gap in the monarchy, which I think is very important, because if you have gaps, then you have opportunities for people to butt in.
Now that she was monarch, the Queen and her family had to move from Clarence House to Buckingham Palace.
The sad thing is that if they could have had a bit longer as a young couple and as a young family, I expect they would have liked to have stayed at Clarence House, which they'd made it very comfortable and very pleasant and a real sort of relaxed family home with their 2 children. And to have to move even a short distance, more or less, across the road was a long, long way in terms of the difference, this great, big, enormous palace. It was very much living over the shop.
I felt very sorry for the Queen. It was such a young age to have that thrust upon you. I don't think she ever imagined that it would come as quickly as it did.
The sombre mood of those early months is recalled by palace footman Cyril Dickman.
The court was in mourning, and obviously there were no great parties or anything like that, or social events for that matter. And we had to wear sort of black armbands, and the members of the forces wore black armbands, you know, like the guard, changing the guard and everything. Stationery was all black-edged, and, you know, all the official stationery.
The household had to keep to that. We kept to that for 3 months, and you had to wear black. Obviously not when you were in the house, but going out, you had to.
More than 300 years ago, the first Queen Elizabeth rode out on her white charger amongst her men at Tilbury to spur them on to attack and repel the greatest threat her country had known to that date. Today, under our second Elizabeth, the country faces difficulties just as great, if less spectacular.
Elizabeth was now Queen, but she was an uncrowned monarch and would remain so for another year. Her coronation day was fixed for June the 2nd, 1953.
It was understood from really very soon after the King's death that it would take a long time to put a coronation together. First of all, the country was in a pretty poor state economically. There was a lot of post-war recovery still to be sorted out. And as Churchill memorably remarked, can't have coronations with bailiffs in the house.
It took much longer to recover from that Second World War than anyone expected. I mean, as an illustration, the month that King George VI died and Queen Elizabeth became Queen, the cheese ration was cut. I think it was cut to 1 ounce a week. Rationing was still going on in this country.
We realised the Ministry of Food, to whom we've been so grateful during the war, wanted to be a permanent nanny and take us what we should eat and how we should eat, and we'd had enough of that, thank you very much. So it was a very strange feeling. And when we got to 1952, we were a grey world. I always feel that life was very grey in Britain.
People couldn't get material for building their houses or rebuilding their houses. People couldn't get raw material to keep their businesses going. The railways ran badly. The weather had been pretty unkind.
But even though 1952 was a gloomy year for Britain, the country looked on the new young Queen as a bright hope for the future.
In the dark days of 1952, it was appreciated that her beauty and her freshness and the fact that she was a woman meant that Britain might be, in the words of a Times editorial, embarking on a new Elizabethan age.
There was a feeling of hope after the, perhaps rather brittle hope after the Second World War, that things would get better and there wouldn't be a repetition of the pattern of the first half of the century and the second.
But while embodying the hopes of a nation, the Queen was still the mother of young children. Her new job meant that she had much less time for Charles, 3, and Anne, just 1.5.
She did make a point of always seeing them at some time in the day, perhaps before their bath or when they were having their tea. But obviously it wasn't easy, not as easy as before she became Queen.
It falls to me as sovereign to assume the colonelcy-in-chief of all 5 regiments comprising the Brigade of Guards.
But it wasn't just the children who were pushed to one side. The Queen's husband, Philip, was also left in the background.
Just as his wife did not expect it to happen quite so soon, I think he didn't expect it to happen so soon. His naval career, it should be remembered, was already over. He'd had effectively to give it up because it was incompatible with the kind of life he was leading as a royal consort. But there was still an element of freedom in his life, and suddenly to realise that that element of freedom was gone must have been a pretty horrifying moment.
When they had married in 1947, Philip had been a lieutenant in the Royal Navy with promising career prospects. The young couple's romance had fired the public's imagination.
To have this fairy tale wedding was marvellous, and you know the crowds were ecstatic as a result, and it was like a dream come true. They were a sensational couple.
Who's afraid to fall in love? Not
I don't think we can really draw a comparison today. I mean, it's absurd to even begin to think in terms of, you know, Burton or Taylor or Posh or Becks or whatever. I mean, those sort of people just didn't come close. This was real stuff. This was a real live person who was going to reign over large parts of the world, and everyone was just incredibly proud about it.
But when his wife became queen, Philip would find himself without a formal role. He would even be told that his family name, Mountbatten, would not be passed on to his children. He'd taken the surname of his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, whose family had brought him up.
Mountbatten started bragging that the House of Mountbatten now reigned in England. Churchill got wind of this via Queen Mary and was appalled. He had no time for Mountbatten at all, saw him as a kind of an ambitious nuisance. And he wasn't going to have the name of the royal family taken over by him. So he very quickly took it to Cabinet, and it's in the Cabinet minutes, and Cabinet quickly agreed to his insistence that it should remain as House of Windsor.
I think Prince Philip took it pretty badly. There's the famous quote where he once said, "I feel like a bloody amoeba," but nevertheless, that was the way it went. Churchill wanted it, the Queen wanted it, full stop.
From the first day of her reign, Elizabeth put her duty to the throne above everything else. It was no surprise. This was the woman who on her 21st birthday had made a passionate vow of service to the Empire.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
Yet by the time Elizabeth came to the throne, the empire was crumbling. India, its very cornerstone, had already become independent. And in March 1952, the Gold Coast became Ghana and the first of Britain's African colonies to achieve independence.
There was an argument that the whole of the African empire was really only created to guard the route to India. And once that Rubicon had been passed, most of the rest of the empire was just a financial liability. Nevertheless, until well into the 1950s, indeed the late 1950s, even the early 1960s, there was a perception that Britain was still an imperial power, an imperial country.
There was an American foreign secretary who said that Britain had lost an empire and not yet found a role. And I think it was about the early 50s that instead of a new Elizabethan age, we really began to wonder what our post-war role in the world was going to be.
The aircraft broke through the sound barrier.
On top of world events, in Elizabeth's first year, Britain suffered a series of freak disasters. On September the 6th, there was tragedy at the Farnborough Air Show when John Derry's test plane, the de Havilland 110, exploded. 2 pilots and 26 spectators were killed.
When a local train was standing at Harrow and Wealdstone Station, crowded with workers on their way to...
On October the 8th, there was the train collision at Harrow and Wealdstone, the second worst on British record. 112 people died.
60 miles an hour. piling up into a hell of wreckage and human suffering. The injured and the dying lay there. The typists, the clerks, the soldiers, the fathers and mothers and children.
And the winter of 1952 brought one of the worst smogs ever known in London. The noxious mixture of smoke and fog caused an estimated 4,000 deaths.
It was extraordinary. It was quite frightening, really, because this great, thick, yellowish cloud of I suppose, really smoke descended on the city, and there was you hardly knew if it was daylight or night. I mean, it was, and lights, didn't penetrate.
Worse was to come. In 1952, flash floods had killed 31 in Lynmouth, Devon. A further 283 were to die in the spring of 1953, when floods hit the east coast of England. Among the survivors were Beatrice Merchant and her daughter Cheryl.
We were all in bed asleep, and I heard water running, and I thought it might be a neighbour's toilet. The toilets were downstairs, and now and again it used to overflow. So my husband got up. It was 4 o'clock in the morning, and he said a few swear words, about Mrs. Ritchell's water. Went downstairs, opened the back door, and the water just flooded in.
Just looking out of your window and imagine you're on a boat, because the amount of water, it was just everywhere. I can remember that, looking out the window and thinking, where has all this water come from? And the fish, all these fish. Were in the living room and in the hallway, all swimming.
To meet the people who have suffered so grievously, Her Majesty the Queen makes a personal visit to the Essex town and enters many...
Like her parents, the Queen was quick to respond to a national disaster.
The Queen continues her journey to Tilbury.
Well, when they said that the Queen was coming, I waited on the pavement just outside the school. And I thought, oh, they've got a lovely skin, and they were smartly dressed. She stayed long enough to shake people's hands and congratulate them on the work they were doing, which, to some, was a bit horrendous. Tommy said he found one poor old lady in the downstairs toilet, dead.
1952 was in many ways a terrible year for the Queen to take over and become Queen, and considering what she was presented with, she did a very good job.
But for the Queen there would be personal tragedy, just 10 weeks before her coronation.
Queen Mary is dead. This great lady of Britain, whose life spanned 6 reigns.
Just 10 weeks before Elizabeth's coronation, her grandmother died.
But she was a nice lady, but she was very regal and quite a stern lady. But she was Queen Mary.
Even to her own family, Queen Mary had been a formidable figure.
Queen Mary was a wonderful character, straight out of a Victorian picture book. Very tall, very upright, marvellous clothes. You felt you must take care to be on your best behaviour. She had a sort of aura about her of somebody who didn't take chances with her.
Queen Mary was a very important figure in the royal family. One shouldn't underestimate that. The fact that she died shortly before the coronation, in a way, was seen by some as this rather bad omen. Interestingly, she was concerned that she herself might not make it to the coronation, but very nobly said in her will she did not want any great fuss made of her as a mother of a monarch and a wife of a monarch. I think she could have expected the full panoply of state funerals, state mourning, you name it. She didn't want that. She knew that what really mattered was the coronation.
Upon the Duke of Norfolk, the Premier Duke of the United Kingdom, falls the main task of organising the coronation. Among the Earl Marshal's many duties before the coronation is to issue regulations about robes to be worn by those attending the service.
The Duke of Norfolk had to oversee every detail of the coronation, but it wasn't his first.
As a boy of 19, he'd had to do the king's coronation. So he had an experience of one, and he'd learned a lot from that. He'd done it remarkably well for somebody who had not been able to pass the necessary exams to get into Oxford, which weren't very difficult in those days.
The Duke of Norfolk had to be very careful who he invited to the coronation. After all, this was a time when divorced people were not allowed into the royal enclosure at Ascot.
When a peer came to Norfolk, thinking that perhaps his divorce status would stand in his way, he said that he would so like to come to the coronation, but that the Duke realised he'd been divorced. To which the Duke of Norfolk said, "Good God, man, this is a coronation, not Ascot."
Months of skilled handiwork have gone into the completion of the coronation robes, in which Abbey...
Well, of course, the coronation was a tremendously exciting time, and as the wife of a peer, we had to get out our red velvet robes with ermine round them, and which had been stored for years. There's always the worry, are they going to be moth-eaten? But they seem to have survived.
I was terribly excited when I got the invitation, and working out how I was going to get there and where the seat was. It was all very exciting.
For ladies other than peeresses, strict regulations are also laid down. Instead of coronets or caps, light veiling falling from the head is permitted. Evening...
The dress had to be a certain width. It had to fit. Had to be on the chair, not overlapping the chair. You had to have your arms covered, and you had to have it either a long dress with a tiara or a short dress with a hat, but you had to have something on your hair.
Next, a creation in chenille lace with a full flare skirt.
For many years after the war, clothing was still rationed. But by 1953, all clothing restrictions had ended, inspiring new coronation fashions.
Now, you've got to be old like me to remember it, but utility clothing was thou shalt not have more than X number of buttons, and you cannot have more than Y number of pleats on a garment. In other words, it was jolly dull. Well, that had gone. I think it had gone the year before. So we were in a mood to be light-hearted, in a mood to enjoy it. But at the back of our minds was the feeling that Britain was going to be Great Britain all over again, and we were going to do things that will be remembered by the world.
In the spring of 1953, coronation fever swept through Britain.
Everything you looked at in every shop window, every toy, every book, everything was about the coronation. At school, that was all we talked about. We had lessons about it. We were encouraged to keep scrapbooks about it. And as I say, so many toys. You'd got the little queen there with her crown on. Some toys she was in a coach. In others she was just made of material, standing up. But all the shop windows had the Queen's toys in, I remember.
The SS Beaverburn arrives at the Royal Albert Docks to a warm welcome from men of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. 10 more Mounties have come to join them in Britain and to ride in the great coronation procession.
The government even ended sweet rationing in time for the coronation.
I can remember sweet rationing. That came off round about that time. I had a birthday party, and my mother covered the whole of my cake in Smarties, and everyone was so excited because they'd never seen so many sweets all on one cake.
Villages and towns around the country organised their own coronation celebrations. Part of the Warrington parade was 5-year-old Paul Dawson.
Well, my costume was a TV set, and really that was derived from the fact my parents had a department store in Warrington, and one of the departments was television, and television was all the rage. It was really coming in at quite a speed at that time. And the television that I was dressed up in was a box with a hole in the top with my head poked through. On the front there was a Muffin the Mule picture and a couple of knobs to simulate the controls, and the rest of it was in simulated wooden finish because everything was wood in those days. I did have a wire trailing out the back with a plug on the back. I remember going past the judges and that rattling on the floor because that's what Mum and Dad told me to do, and then one of the officials shot out and said, "Oh, you can't have that trailing on the floor," and picked it up and handed it to me and said, "You have to carry it." And I said, "You can't see it, it's underneath now." And he says, "Carry it." So I carried it.
This was to be the first televised coronation. It would mark the beginning of the television age for broadcasters like Richard Dimbleby.
My father had been offered a choice between being the radio commentator and the television commentator. And in those days, television was a tiny upstart. Radio was where it was at. Millions of people, 10, 15 million people would tune in to the home service. A few 100,000 would tune into television. But he had for some time believed that television was the future. So the decision by the BBC to cover the coronation was something that for him represented where the future would lie.
Thousands crowd outside Buckingham Palace, despite the fact that it's about 7 o'clock in the morning, to watch a procession pass down the Mall under the splendid coronation arches in rehearsal for June the 2nd. With blinds drawn, the royal coach of state provides the glittering centrepiece of the procession as it moves towards Westminster Abbey.
I remember my grandma and granddad taking me up to see the decorations, and we must have been near Whitehall, and my grandma said, "Oh, quickly, we've got to go down here." And we went down to the side door of Westminster Abbey, and the Queen and Prince Philip were going in for a rehearsal.
There's a great history of errors taking place in coronations. For instance, at Queen Victoria's, Lord Rolle tripped and rolled down the steps of the throne, and everyone thought that that was a job that he was supposed to do by ancient custom with a name like that. There was also the ring was jammed by the Archbishop of Canterbury onto the wrong finger, and she says in her diary that night that by dipping her finger into icy water, causing her great pain, she did manage to finally get the thing off. So there was a determination even, I suppose, in 1953 to make sure that because the world was going to see this, they practiced it relentlessly.
The coach of state arrives at the Abbey where Her Majesty is to be crowned. Pathé News is ready for that historic occasion, all set to film the full splendor of the momentous day. The world's finest equipment will be used, including the largest telephoto lens in the world and the zoom lens, which cost over £1,000, to bring the complete magnificent spectacle to this theatre.
I think the media were totally fawning and totally obsequious, but then so was public opinion. There was a kind of interplay, a conversation between public opinion and the media, which was entirely mutual and which both egged each other on.
Once again, the Daily Mail Ideal Home exhibition at Olympia becomes a major London attraction. This being Coronation year, the centrepiece of the exhibition is a magnificent replica, 2/3 life size, of Her Majesty's state coach and its attendants. The Queen and
there was a kind of semi-divine worship of the young person of the Queen. But looking back, I mean, it no doubt reflected many things, and it probably mainly reflected just kind of sheer relief at survival after the Second World War, and sheer relief at the recovery of the economy and prosperity and so on. It felt like a good time, 1953.
30,000 people spent the night in the Mall on the eve of the coronation. One of them was 11-year-old Jill Marseille.
The day before the coronation, we all got together and went up to London. There were about 22 of us then, and we found a place on the Air Ministry steps to stay. And that, I think my mum said, this is where we're going to be. So if you get lost or if you go out, this is where we'll be. And we slept there all night. We got very wet and we sort of dried off and then we got wet again. But it didn't matter because we were all so happy and so excited. That's the main thing I remember. Everybody was happy and laughing.
That night, amazing news was announced on the streets.
I can remember the news vendors, we used to call them, coming along shouting and selling a paper and they were shouting out, "Everest has been conquered, Everest has been conquered."
Tenzing and I had been climbing together a good deal, and I think we'd become a fairly happy pair.
Everest had been conquered by a Nepalese Sherpa called Tenzing and New Zealander Edmund Hillary, but it was considered a British triumph.
Although it's rather hard to claim a Sherpa as being British, Hillary was a New Zealander, and at that time, a New Zealander was felt to be practically British. Of course, the Queen reigned in New Zealand, but there was felt to be very, very little distinction between being British and New Zealander. And the Commonwealth at that time was that tight that that sort of assumption could be made.
An inspiring omen on the eve of a coronation. June the 2nd was cold and wet, but the crowds didn't care. Nobody could rain on their parade.
Suddenly along comes this remarkable show. The eyes of the world descend on London. It touches all the buttons that coronations have sort of touched throughout the centuries. There was this fairy tale dimension to it. And don't forget, at the time, you had this famous statistic of about a quarter of the people believing that the Queen had been appointed by God.
I think from about 6 o'clock everything started happening, and I can remember being told, "Gillian, you're not moving now till we leave," because we'd have lost our places. And soldiers came along to line the route, and the men selling the periscopes and the flags. I remember that. But then it got quieter, and you realised the roads were all shut off. And I suppose nearer the time, big black cars came along with people in going to Westminster Abbey.
We had to be in the Abbey by 7. So the car picked me up, I think it was 6:30. And we were sitting there for virtually 3 hours because the service didn't start till 10:30. And we were frozen. It was so cold. Everyone was shivering. And once you were in your seat, you were meant to stay there, unless, by any chance, you wanted to get out and go to the loo. They had these loos built onto to the side of the Abbey. And the rain, when you went in there, you could hear this rain on the corrugated roof, deafening, and terrible queues.
In fact, those coronets were very useful because quite a few of the peers kept their sandwiches in there, because of course you couldn't very well put them in your pockets and things. You had to be in the Abbey good and early, several hours before things were happening. And you got rather hungry and thirsty, and so rather discreetly the sandwiches were removed from the coronets and eaten in an interval.
At 10:30 in the morning, the golden coach left Buckingham Palace and set off for Westminster Abbey.
And then the carriage came along. Her face looked lovely. She was smiling a lot. I remember her looking very young. To see her it was quite magic, because I don't think you ever thought you would ever see the Queen.
Every country in the Empire and Commonwealth joined in the celebrations. Some guests had travelled thousands of miles.
Then this lady came along. We didn't know who she was, and she had a big hat on her head. And by then it was raining very hard. And this lady was just laughing and laughing and smiling. You could see her smiling right from when you started to see her till she'd gone. And then afterwards we were told that was the Queen of Tonga.
There was a complete hush before the arrival of the Queen. And to my absolute amazement, 3 or 4 lovely cleaning ladies appeared with hoovers. I don't know where they plugged them in, with overalls, and proceeded, I suppose understandably, but it didn't look as though the carpet had any mud or anything on it, but I suppose in case anyone had dropped anything, they sort of hoovered the whole lot.
As well as the hundreds of thousands that lined the route, an estimated 20 million watched it on television.
My mum said, as soon as they'd all gone past the whole procession, she said, if we can get to the train quick enough, I remember saying, Daddy will meet us at the station at Morden. And we got home in time to see her being crowned.
Others were not so lucky. Beatrice and Cheryl Merchant had lost everything in the floods.
My television went under the water, the floods, along with my sewing machine. And anything electrical, the cooker, couldn't use it. A whole home gone.
Had gone, and there was all this splendour going on, but we were still in mud.
In mud?
Yeah.
We didn't even possess a television in 1953 at home, but we decided this was such an important event for everybody, all our employees and people around about, that we would hire a television. So we hired what I seem to remember was a very small television. It was probably the biggest there was. And everybody sat around and watched it, and which was lovely because they really felt that they were there and taking part in something, and most of them had met the Queen and Prince Philip from when they were staying with us. So it was a nice thing to be able to do.
The coronation was the great turning point in the spread of mass television. Richard Dimbleby had been right.
First, the Archbishop will speak to the east, to all those gathered here on each side of the sanctuary.
I here present unto you Queen Elizabeth, your undoubted Queen.
The words of the Archbishop of Canterbury stop and the words of Richard Dimbleby take over, and then the Archbishop of Canterbury comes in again. And sometimes you're not quite certain who's playing what part. Was Richard Dimbleby conducting the service or the Archbishop of Canterbury? And in truth, it didn't really matter either way. What mattered was the overall impact, which I think in most people's memory at least was overwhelmingly powerful.
4 Knights of the Garter, the Dukes of Wellington and Portland, the Earl Fortescue and the Viscount Arundel, bring forward a golden canopy, which they hold over Her Majesty, so that the sacred moment of anointing, normally never seen, is shielded from all eyes.
The most sacred part of the coronation is the anointing, and was not filmed because it was so significant in religious terms. This is when the Archbishop actually places holy oil on the forehead and different parts of the sovereign's body, therefore making them sacred to their role. This is the point beyond which there is no return, because the anointing is done by the Church but on behalf of God. So once anointed, she's gone beyond, and the Church has really done all it can.
O God, the crown of the faithful, bless, we beseech thee, this crown, and so sanctify thy servant Elizabeth, upon whose head this day thou dost place it for a sign of royal majesty.
The coronation was a remarkable event. I don't think my generation can probably begin to understand the impact it had, that after all these terrible years of war and these very gloomy, austere post-war years of rationing, of trying to catch up, put life back together again. It was in every way as perhaps as vital as today, I don't know, England winning the World Cup or something like that. Bigger than that. I don't think we can understand what it was like. But it really did, I think, change the way that people thought about themselves and change the way in which the world thought about Britain. It was a seismic moment.
6 months earlier, in her Christmas broadcast to the Empire, the Queen had anticipated the moment of her crowning.
At my coronation, I want to ask you all, whatever your religion may be, to pray that God may give me wisdom and strength to carry out the solemn promises I shall be making, and that I may faithfully serve him and you all the days of my life.
That vow to serve was a promise she would keep for the rest of the century and beyond.
In a golden coach there's a heart of gold. world that belongs to you and me.
Something very different next Thursday. Here come details.